Hello and welcome to Chapter 11, Monetary Policy and Debates. So here we look at, we looked at the Fed, now we look at the monetary policy of the Fed. We know what the tools are, but how should the Fed conduct monetary policy? In other words, when should it use its tools and by how much should it use its tools and which tools should it use? We've already discussed kind of which tools it does use, which is open market operations mostly, but also there's the discount window that is used. And we know that minimum reserve requirements are there, but they're not really altered, so they're not used as a policy lever. So, what should the goals of monetary policy be? When should we alter monetary policy? What's the criteria here? Well, price stability, what's sometimes called price level stability, but price stability is one of the most important goals of monetary policy. Price stability actually is a more recent concept. In fact, I remember one of my professors in my PhD program told me, monetary policy is full of fashions and fads. And, there are certain things that are in vogue at any point in time that economists generally think are a good idea, and then they move on to some other thing that's in vogue. And you'll see that throughout this chapter. We're going to talk about various periods of time when monetary policy ideas kind of were focused on certain things and how they've shifted over time. Well, right now, the general consensus is that the most important kind of element of monetary policy is price stability. And what I mean by price stability is low levels of inflation. And the goal here is to keep inflation from becoming a problem, or deflation for that matter. Deflation, of course, meaning negative inflation. So, I don't really like this phrase, by the way, price level stability, because price level stability implies that the price level is stable and therefore inflation is zero. That's not quite what most central bankers mean when they talk about price stability. So they omit that level. What they mean is that prices are relatively stable and they have a preference for very, very slowly rising prices over time. So usually when central bankers talk about price stability, what they mean is an inflation rate of between 0 and 2% roughly. So price level stability, how much stability is optimal? It's a good question. A lot of criticism has been raised at the Fed for actually following price stability as a target for their policy, so as a goal for their policy, I should say, rather than the other part of their mandate in the Federal Reserve Act, which is high levels of employment. And we're going to talk about that a little later. So the price stability goal and the nominal anchor. Over the past few decades, policymakers throughout the world have become increasingly aware of the social and economic costs of inflation. So part of the reason why the emphasis has been on low levels of inflation is that, of course, we had a period in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly the early 1980s, when we had high levels of inflation in this country. And there was a consensus among economists that high levels of inflation, or relatively high levels of inflation, I should say, are not a good thing. So this is why monetary policy kind of moved towards the idea that if high levels of inflation or moderately high levels of inflation are not a good thing, maybe they should be the goal of monetary policy to make them a kind of a lower thing. And that actually originated in New Zealand, interestingly enough, where the Parliament of New Zealand gave their central bank, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, a mandate to keep inflation below a certain level. And interestingly, how they did this was to pass an act, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Act. But part of the act was very clever, because what it did is it tied the head of the central bank, it tied the governor's bonus to the level of inflation. So if the governor managed to keep inflation below a certain level, then he was given a bonus. If he didn't, it was a he at that time, then he didn't get the bonus. So there was a kind of an incentive put in place for the central bank governor, the head of the central bank in New Zealand, to actually follow the price stability kind of goals that were set up by the Parliament in New Zealand. So the role of a nominal anchor, the idea here is that there should be something that you look at that is readily available, published, and is very transparent in terms of, why the central bank might change its monetary policy. So in other words, you have some kind of goal, and it's an anchor, if you like. It's a way of pinning down monetary policy, and you follow that over time, and that determines when you change monetary policy. So if the inflation rate went above a certain level, then you might increase interest rates to try and dampen down economic growth and pull the inflation rate to below that level again. Or you might pick money supply as a nominal anchor as well. We're going to talk about those in terms of how they fit into the framework of monetary policy making later on in the chapter. Now, there is a so-called time inconsistency problem here. And what's time inconsistency? Well, the concept of time inconsistency is really simple to understand. It's the idea that in the short term, you have certain incentives, and then in the long term, you have a different set of incentives, and they may not be consistent. So in other words, the central bank might say, okay, well, 2% is the level. We're not going to let inflation go above 2%. But if inflation does go above 2%, then they might let it go above 2% because they don't want to be seen to increase interest rates and cause economic growth to suffer at any particular time, because they might not want to come in for the criticism. So their long-term objective of keeping inflation below 2% might not be consistent with their short-term objective, where they might come in for a lot of criticism and therefore they will let it go above 2%. We have a time inconsistency problems in lots of areas in life. Another one would be dieting. We can all say that, I'm going to go on a diet today. I'm not going to eat, much at all. And that's my long-term objective, to lose a certain amount of pounds. Well, the trouble is, every day, you might say, I'm going to cheat today. But the trouble is, if you cheat every day, then you're not going to meet your long-term objective. So, you can see there's a time inconsistency problem there. Now, one of the things about the Fed, unlike most other central banks, so this is a kind of an important topic in a way. Unlike most other central banks, the Fed has a dual mandate. So the ECB, for instance, doesn't have a dual mandate, nor does the Bank of Canada, nor does the Bank of England. They have what we call hierarchical mandates. So typically, these hierarchical mandates have the goal of price stability as number one, and then as long as that is achieved, they can worry about secondary type of goals, maximize employment, etc. Now, the Fed is probably one of the only central banks in the world, or one of the few central banks in the world. I think Reserve Bank of South Africa, as I recall, also has a similar dual mandate. But a dual mandate the Fed has of achieving two equal or co-equal objectives. So in the case of the Fed, it's price stability and maximum employment, which the Fed has interpreted to mean output stability. So, that's the dual mandate of the Fed. So the Fed has come in for some criticism lately that it's been focusing too much on the price stability aspect of its mandate and not on its long-run goal of maximum employment. And incidentally, that was one of the criticisms that Donald Trump had made of the Fed. So, which is best? Well, economists really are not decided on this, and you can see here it says either type of mandate is acceptable as long as it operates to make price stability the primary goal in the long run, but not the short run. In other words, price stability, having low inflation, there should be some kind of adaptability to certain circumstances. So, for instance, you might have a situation where oil prices spike or something, and that pushes inflation above 2%. Well, should the central bank act? Probably not in that case, because it's just an oil price that's caused inflation to go up, and that oil price increase, can't be continued forever. So it's likely to go into reverse, or it's likely to plateau and then not be an issue. So, price stability should be really the long-run goal of monetary policy. What are other goals of monetary policy? Well, there are 5 other goals that are continually mentioned by central bank officials. So, these aren't official mandated goals by Congress, but they are things that the Fed worries about. So therefore, they are kind of sub-goals, if you like. So one is this high employment and output stability, and in the Fed's case, as I said, that is co-equal with price stability officially. Economic growth, that's also in there, and that's one of the reasons why the Fed has acted recently with the COVID-19 economic contraction that we're seeing. Stability of financial markets, the Fed obviously oversees financial markets as well, so that's obviously a concern for them. It's a goal for them. Interest rate stability, the Fed doesn't like to see interest rates move around rapidly, so having violent moves in interest rates. It likes things to be gradual and things to change gradually over time. Also, and this is really not important for the Fed, I would say, but it is for other central banks. Stability in foreign exchange markets, particularly if you have a fixed exchange rate. That's another topic that's discussed in international economics, of course. We're not going to really discuss that here. So the high employment goal, he questions whether it should be one of the goals of monetary policy, but, it's there. It's in the mandate. But what determines the level of employment? Well, it's the skill levels of the labor force, derived demand of output, the level of uncertainty in business, among other things. So a ton of things. And, high employment implies, of course, low unemployment. And remember that unemployment, has various different types. So there are 4 types of unemployment. You'll remember that from your intermediate macro, hopefully. And the first is frictional. Frictional, if you remember, is people changing jobs. Structural is basically a change in the structure of the economy. And cyclical. So the one that the Fed's going to be mostly worried about here is cyclical. Frictional and structural and seasonal, by the way, is the 4th one that's not on that list. But seasonal and frictional and structural are not something that the Fed can really do too much about. Cyclical is something that the Fed can be focused on because it's to do with the business cycle, and the monetary policy can obviously impact the business cycle. Interest rates and exchange rates. Stable interest rates also make business investment decisions easier because the cost of capital for firms will fluctuate less. So that's one of the incentives for the Fed to not have rapid movements in interest rates up or down. And it increased the amounts of durable good households could purchase. So in other words, many people purchase washing machines and other household big ticket household items on what we call hire purchase. That's on a loan with a rate of interest that's fixed, not fixed, but often is variable. So that variable interest rate can change up and down, and that also can obviously impact the amount of durable goods that people buy. If it's very, very expensive to take a loan, then you might not get that new washing machine, or you might not buy that new computer, or you might not replace your car, etc. Stable exchange rates are also important for central banks because it makes it easier for exporters and importers to make contracts because they know that the exchange rate's not going to vary too much. That's particularly important for developing countries, by the way. And, he ends up by saying, well, should financial market stability, that is really interest rates and exchange rate stability, should that be part of monetary policy as well? In the US, it kind of is indirectly, but it's not explicitly mentioned as a goal of monetary policy. So here we're going to move on to talk about how we operationalize, if you like, price stability. And we operationalize it by using, and I already kind of mentioned this by talking about the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, by using inflation targeting. So what is inflation targeting? It's a public announcement of a medium-term numerical target for inflation. By medium term, we mean kind of talking in years about where we should be with inflation. And it's an institutional commitment to price stability is the primary long-run goal of monetary policy, a commitment to achieve the inflation goal. Information-inclusive approach in which many variables are used in making decisions. So inflation targeting, oftentimes, there's a big focus on the things that impact inflation, whether that's wholesale price inflation, import price inflation, anything to do with inflation. And central banks usually are very, very focused on that. And I can confirm that because I've spent time at central banks, and they are very interested in what drives inflation, obviously, because that's one of the things that they're supposed to be focused on in terms of their goals. In more recent years, central banks have become much more transparent in terms of how they look at this particular goal, how they look at inflation. In fact, the Fed, up until recently, I believe, has been publishing inflation forecasts. So each president of the district Fed makes a forecast, and those dot plots, as they're called, are usually circulated to the media when the minutes. Straight after the meeting is concluded. So then you have to wait for the minutes. Excuse me. And central banks increasingly are supposed to be more accountable, in the sense that there has been some focus on what they do, and they are public bodies, or quasi-public bodies in the case of the Fed, and therefore what they do and their policies should be available for public scrutiny. Now, I've already talked about New Zealand, so I talked about their policy. That was made effective in 1990, and it was deemed to be successful. Inflation was brought down and remained within the target most of the time. And actually, this really changed New Zealand's outlook, economic outlook, I should say. They'd had very weak growth, but from that point onwards, New Zealand has been a very fast-growing economy, and with relatively low levels of unemployment. Canada adopted it next in 1991, and Canada has really had some success with it. There was originally some cost in terms of unemployment, I should say, but the Bank of Canada's primary goal, so it doesn't have a dual mandate, it has a single mandate of price stability. So that's what it's focused on. It's focused on Canadian inflation rates. The UK also has price inflation targeting, I should say, and inflation has been close to its target. Growth has been strong and unemployment has been decreasing. That is until lately, of course, with this coronavirus downturn. And here I think we can see, when the targets were adopted. And in some cases, there's a target range. If you look at the first one, that's New Zealand. You can see when the inflation targeting begins. Look at how things were before inflation targeting. You had inflation rates in New Zealand of nearly 20%, so 15% for quite a few years there in the 1980s. And going into, we had inflation up at around 6% when they started inflation targeting. And you can see there were some steps down, there were some ranges down. They easily beat those ranges very quickly and got inflation down into roughly 1%. Of course, the governor's salary depended on it at the time. You can see that they've changed the mid-range of that target. That's a dotted line there, and it's gone up a bit. So it's now, I think, between 1% and 3% in New Zealand is the target range. You can see it does go outside of the target range. When that happens, the Reserve, the governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has to write a letter to Parliament explaining why it's gone out of the range and the steps that they're taking to get it back in the range. That's what has to happen. You see Canada's record here. They've got lots of ups and downs there, but largely when it's risen above the target range, and theirs is, I believe, 1% to 3% again. They pulled it back down. They don't have to write letters in this case. There has been one occasion where you can see the 2008-2009 recession where actually their inflation rate went negative. They had some deflation there. But that's just as much of a concern when you have a target range. So the fact it was below 1% meant the Bank of Canada had to act. In that case, it had to ease monetary policy to try and stimulate the economy. And there's the UK's. The UK's level is, I think, from half or something like that to, it's 1 to 4 or something like that it was, and then it came down. You can see where it came down. I'm not sure what it is right now, but you can see there was some success there in keeping the inflation rate between, the target. Now, looking before then, in the UK and in Canada, you can see inflation was considerably higher. So those people who are in favor of these inflation targets, they point to, what happened before we had these inflation targets. Now, in the Fed's case, there is no hard inflation target. So hard meaning, they don't have to write a letter or anything to Congress, but they have soft, what we call a soft target. And they like to keep inflation preferably below. Their range is roughly 2 to 4%, as I recall. They want to try and keep it in that range. So what are the advantages of inflation targeting? Well, it doesn't rely on one variable to achieve the target. So in other words, that's the target. We can vary other things and we can see how that affects inflation. It's very easy to understand and to communicate to the general public. So the governor or the head of the central bank can easily go to the media and say, this is what we have to do and this is our objective. It reduces the potential of falling into this time inconsistency trap because it's a long-term objective as well. So, short-term doesn't matter too much if you diverge, go outside of those target bands, as long as you make efforts to get back within those target bands. And it also stresses transparency and accountability of the central bank, because the central bank is seen in public to have to act or should act and has to explain itself. The disadvantage is that, the trouble with inflation is that it's a lagging indicator, lagging in the sense that inflation happens kind of after something's happened in the economy. So there's delayed signaling here, and so then the Fed can act, I guess, but all of this happens after the fact. It's not really, and as well, you don't get those inflation numbers until usually a month after. So everything's kind of one step behind, if you like. Some criticize it, saying there's too much rigidity, and some say that there's potential for increased output in fluctuations if you target inflation. And oftentimes, during disinflation, when you're trying to bring inflation rates down into that range or into a specific range, you get low economic growth and higher unemployment during that period. Okay, I'm going to take a break here and do a part 2. Thank you.